Hurricane Helene plowed into Florida more than a week ago as a Category 4 storm with 140-mile-an-hour winds. It landed near Perry in the Big Bend area, but the devastation also tore through Sarasota, Manatee, Pinellas, Hillsborough, Pasco, Citrus, Hernando, and Levy counties. From Florida, it smacked into Georgia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee. More than 200 people have been confirmed dead. Hundreds more are missing. Much of the damage was from flooding and storm surge. Neighborhoods that had previously weathered large storms were, for the first time, underwater. Communities like the Pinellas Beaches, St. Armand's Key, Davis Islands, neighborhoods near the water in South Tampa, and Shore Acres all experienced record flooding. Residents began the slow and painful process of throwing out flooded furniture, clothing, and personal items, such as family photos, cleaning out the mud, and tearing down ruined drywall.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Like, I haven't stopped to... I'm doing okay. It just is weird, but it could have been so much worse.
17 counties in Florida were declared part of the federal disaster area. That federal assistance can include grants for temporary housing and home repairs, low-cost loans to cover uninsured property losses, and other programs to help individuals and business owners to recover. Despite the scale of the disaster, many residents and business owners are vowing to rebuild.
It's pretty devastating, but there's the two sides, like everything in life, right? So there's the side about this is incredibly devastating and everything might be over, and the community spirit and the human spirit that goes, okay, we're going to do this. Let's bring it back.
We will not leave, and the people around here are resilient, and they absolutely pull together.
Well, the day before Hurricane Helene struck, there was a vote in Congress on a measure that would continue funding the federal government and provide billions of dollars in extra disaster assistance. These Florida members of Congress voted against the extra funding for FEMA disaster relief. Even though many Florida Congress members voted against the disaster assistance, the measure finally did pass. Jeff, let's start with you. Was this foreseeable? And, is this the new normal that we're expecting to see?
Florida averages on about 1.8 storms a year as far as hurricanes go. But this is by far the largest flooding event that we've seen, at least in my lifetime. Obviously, we had Hurricane Ian a couple of years ago. But this storm was a kind of next level, not so much on the wind side, but on the flood side. Obviously devastating for those in Cedar Key in that area. But honestly, if you're going to be hit by a Category 4 storm in Florida, the Big Bend area, as far as damage-wise, is probably the best place for Florida to get hit because it will do the least amount of at least wind damage. But the water damage, the flooding damage is really unlike anything we've seen in at least my lifetime. And I know a lot of my friends and neighbors are really struggling as we're kind of picking up the pieces.
Do you think climate change is involved?
Listen, I think the climate has always been changing. I think this storm, just as fast as it was going, as large as it was, I think it really is one of those issues where we've just never seen anything like this. Florida's had floods before, it's had hurricanes before, obviously, but the water level rise that we've seen, how it hit during high tide, it really is what drove a lot of this flooding damage. And I think people are going to be, it's going to be really 6 months to a year before we see this transition take place throughout Florida as far as recovery.
Jennifer, do you think this is the new normal because of climate change?
It's absolutely the new normal because of climate change. I broke it down yesterday. I was just considering these things. And in 1950 is when they started naming storms. 98 names have been retired in that time. Since 2000, 48 names have been retired, and it will now be 49. So over 50% of the names have been retired due to the severity of the storms since 2000. In a third of the amount of time that they've been naming the storms. This is absolutely the new normal. I could go down the list. It is a very long list. I've lived through many of them, and they keep getting worse. We can't say it's a once-in-a-lifetime storm. Harvey was a once-in-a-lifetime storm. Katrina was a once-in-a-lifetime storm. This was no, it's not. It's the new normal.
Mm-hmm. So, Kimberly, what's your take on how the governor has approached and dealt with the disaster?
Well, he definitely has been on the ground communicating quite a lot. He's been doing events all over the state, both before the hurricane hit, and then right before it made landfall at 11 p.m. And then today he did an event at Anna Maria Island, and we're taping on Thursday, and he is opting to do that instead of meet with President Joe Biden, who also is landing here in Florida on Thursday. So he's being very present, but he also, not only did he, not meet with President Biden, but he also has been drawing a contrast, as we've written in Playbook for Politico, between the state response and the federal response. So typically in these times of tragedy, you see more bipartisanship, working together, a show of unity. In this case, I would say the governor is being pretty vocal at every stop that he's made about where he feels like the state has stepped up in ways that the federal government cannot or has not, including, being able to get vehicles to various areas, RVs, so that people can live there who've lost their homes. He has sent helicopters to North Carolina, essentially tacitly saying that the federal government isn't doing enough there. So he is being very present. He's communicating a lot, but he also is, I would say, using the opportunity to draw the contrast with the federal government, which is what he does often, even in non-disaster times.
Tribell, I want to ask you about a 60 Minutes report that was on last Sunday that said that at least one company was underpaying the claims that adjusters had written up after Hurricane Ian. And I just wondered, what's the feeling in Tallahassee? Has the insurance crisis in Florida been fixed? And is there any talk perhaps of a special session to deal more with the insurance crisis here in Florida?
It's to be seen, and the insurance crisis is an ongoing issue. From a personal experience, I transferred to Citizens Property Insurance, which is the insurance company of last resort, because my private insurance company was so high, I could not even deal with that 70% increase. And the depopulation effort occurring right now, October 11th, I am being transferred out of Citizen and back to my company that I essentially ran away from. Suddenly they're 70% more affordable. So this is an ongoing issue. My issue is not unique. The state is going through its process of trying to offload a lot of people from Citizens Property Insurance. The insurance crisis is ongoing, it needs attention, and it's playing out as we speak. And with this storm right now, we're going to see how claims go.
Jeff, a lot of those people that we saw in the video at the start of this segment said that they were going to rebuild. Is rebuilding a good idea? How expensive is it? What are the drawbacks to rebuilding? And talk about that.
So I think first the thing to know is this is largely a water event. Most people's property insurance does not cover flood insurance. A vast majority of properties are not going to be that have property insurance. Many of these will also have flood insurance if they lived in the coastal areas, or we're going to be required by their mortgage carrier. But some of them are not going to have flood insurance as well.
And they're going to have to rely on federal help.
And they're going to have to rely on federal help, which is very meager, like $5,000 to $7,000 from FEMA grants for many of these people. But I think it's important to note that this is not going to, I don't think, is a major impact to the rates of Florida policyholders as far as their property insurance rates. But I do think people need to know that they need to have flood insurance if they live in the state. Nobody in Florida is more than 70 miles away from the coast. Everybody should be getting flood insurance. That's what this storm should highlight, and the big takeaway from this storm should be is that you need to have flood insurance for this storm. But I think to your question, look, I think it's going to take time. People are going to have to. It's going to take time for people to recover from this. I don't think this is going to be a major impact on the property insurers of the state of Florida, though.
I want to ask you about places like Shore Acres. There are grants around to raise houses up above the floodplain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's called the FEMA 50% rule, which basically says if the payout for your home after, as far as your insurance payment, exceeds 50% of the value of the structure on the property, then you have to bring your home up to current floodplain levels, and that for many people will be $300,000 to $500,000. And if you only got $150,000 in payment out, well, maybe there's some loans and other things that you could take out, but a lot of these people are just going to choose to sell at that point. And so I think you're going to see this is the storm that I think is going to transform a lot of these neighborhoods. We've had floods, and a lot of these people have had floods, as recently as this year. But this is the storm where you've seen 3 or 4 foot water levels on their sides of their home that I think is going to be the one that kind of breaks the back of many of these people, and they finally decide that now is the time to sell or move on.
Jennifer, the state does have a program to try to encourage people to not build back in dangerous areas, and they've tried it out in the Florida Keys. But should people be building back so close to the waterfront, and should we encourage them to move a little bit further inland?
In my personal opinion, in my dreamland, yes, absolutely. Barrier Islands, my daughter is an environmental scientist studying sand migrations. Sand moves, and by nature it's going to move. And historically, through time, those islands shifted all the way around every coast, and we've tried to make them permanent. Because we have so much out on these islands, especially in the state of Florida, it's tourism, and we're tourism-based, and our tax base is from tourism. I don't see it happening, but ideally, yes, for humanity, I do think that we need to stop building on barrier islands and moving further inland, absolutely.
Kimberly, let me ask you about the politics of this. Earlier this week, the Washington Post looked at the counties from here to North Carolina that were most affected by the disaster, and those counties tended to vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Do we have any sense of how this disaster in Florida is going to affect the political scene, affect the November election?
Well, all these things become political, right? Especially if they're responded to in a way that is inadequate, whether, actually inadequate or just cast that way, it becomes a big political message. We saw former President Donald Trump bring that up on Sunday in a rally. And then he announced that he was going to Georgia. And essentially he was saying, well, why is President Joe Biden in Rehoboth at the beach? And why is Vice President Harris in California doing fundraisers? So it all becomes very political. And it's supposed to be a way to kind of convince, they're not just saying, oh, they're doing a bad job. They're trying to say that they're unfit to be president, that they can't be there in times of crisis, et cetera. The same messaging has been used against Trump by the Harris campaign. It's been less focused on the response because obviously he's not in office, but they have been messaging on his positions on climate change and also areas of Project 2025 that they say could harm, the hurricane response and things like that. So it's always, especially when it's this close to an election, it is something that does, become that way. And I don't, there are instances where leaders can stand together and show unity, for instance, but that doesn't mean that the fights over who should lead go away.
And Tramel, the day before Helene hit up in Congress in Washington, there was a vote on whether or not to extend FEMA disaster funding until December 20th. A lot of Florida members of Congress voted against that. What's your best take on whether or not, if that vote were to come up today, would we see like 100% of Florida members of Congress vote for FEMA disaster aid?
We'd hope, and as just mentioned, politics is playing a role as we're getting so close to the election. As the president comes into Tallahassee and the governor is not here to greet and meet. As mentioned, usually around these disaster times, it's a time of unity. Everyone comes together for the greater good of everyone involved. But the proximity to the election and how things are playing out and who's trying to get the upper hand in the eyes of the public, we hope politics doesn't go that way, but sadly, that's the state of affairs that we're in. If the vote were held today, we hope that they would vote in favor. That's what's best for all of us, but it's to be seen.
All right, well, before we go to the next topic, we're going to put up on the screen some ways you can help after the Hurricane Helene disaster.